Beneath the sun-scorched deserts of modern-day Iraq, buried under layers of time and shifting sands, lies the story of the world's first empire. An empire whose very name was nearly lost to history. The Akkadian Empire, the first political entity to unite multiple city-states under a single ruler, predates even Babylon and Assyria. It was a civilization of warriors, kings, and poets, a world where gods walked alongside men, and power was measured not just in conquest, but in the ability to command an entire region. Yet, despite its monumental impact on human history, the Akkadians have long been overshadowed by the more famous civilizations that came after them. Their capital, if it still exists, remains undiscovered, and their story is often reduced to footnotes in the grand narrative of Mesopotamian history. But why? How could such a mighty empire, the first of its kind, disappear so completely? To understand the Akkadians, we must start in Baghdad, a city where history refuses to be forgotten. The capital of modern Iraq is a place of contrasts, a bustling metropolis where ancient traditions meet the digital age, where call to prayer echoes through streets lined with both traditional markets and neon-lit storefronts. But beneath the pavement, beneath the foundations of mosques, palaces, and houses, lies something older, something hidden. Every street in Baghdad rests on the remains of past civilizations, layer upon layer of history compressed into the earth like pages of a forgotten book. Just beyond the city's outskirts, the past begins to emerge. Scattered throughout the vast, arid landscape of southern Iraq are the remains of cities that once stood at the heart of the first human civilizations. Some are barely distinguishable from the sand that covers them, mere mounds rising slightly above the surrounding plains. Others, like and Uruk, still reveal glimpses of their former grandeur, crumbling ziggurats and shattered walls that once formed the backbone of Mesopotamian power. In particular, stands as a testament to the ingenuity and ambition of ancient peoples. Located in what was once Sumer, the city was a major hub of commerce and culture, a place where merchants from distant lands traded gold, lapis lazuli, and spices. It was here, according to tradition, that the biblical patriarch Abraham was born. Long before the Akkadians, flourished as a city-state, its people worshipping the moon god Nana, constructing massive temples, and recording their daily lives in cuneiform, the world's first written script. To the people of writing was more than a tool for trade or governance. It was a way to preserve history, a way to immortalize kings and gods alike. For centuries, the existence of these cities, Uruk, Akkad, was known only through scattered references in ancient texts. The Bible spoke of Abraham's origins. Greek historians hinted at forgotten Mesopotamian rulers, and Arab scholars told of lost civilizations swallowed by the desert. But it wasn't until the 19th century that these stories were confirmed. Western archaeologists, armed with a deep curiosity and a desire to uncover the past, arrived in Mesopotamia and began to dig. What they found would change our understanding of history forever. Among these discoveries, one of the most groundbreaking was the deciphering of cuneiform script. This was no simple task. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, which had the benefit of the Rosetta Stone as a guide, cuneiform had no such key. It took years of painstaking work, comparing repeated symbols and cross-referencing ancient languages before scholars unlocked its secrets. When they did, they uncovered an entire world of forgotten kings, battles, and myths. The tablets spoke of great floods, of wars between city-states, and of gods who shaped the fate of mankind. They also told of a man named Sargon, a leader unlike any before him, who forged an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Sargon of Akkad, the first true emperor in human history, was a figure of legend even in his own time. He rose from humble beginnings, his origins shrouded in myth. Some stories say he was the illegitimate son of a priestess, cast adrift on a river as an infant, an eerie parallel to the tales of Moses and Romulus. He was discovered and raised in the city of Kish, eventually rising to power and overthrowing the king he once served. But Sargon's ambition did not stop at ruling a single city. He would go on to conquer the entirety of Sumer, defeating the powerful Lugal-Zaghazi and seizing control of Uruk and beyond. His empire, centered around the city of Akkad, became the first known instance of a centralized, multi-ethnic state ruled by a single authority. But what made the Akkadian Empire truly revolutionary was not just its size or military might, it was the way it changed the very fabric of civilization. For the first time, a common language, Akkadian, was imposed across a vast territory, replacing Sumerian in official and administrative affairs. Trade routes expanded, connecting Mesopotamia to distant lands like the Indus Valley and Anatolia. Governance became more structured, with local rulers answering directly to the emperor. The Akkadians transformed warfare, introducing new military tactics, standardizing weapons, and maintaining a standing army. And yet, for all their greatness, the Akkadians did not last. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, their empire crumbled. The reasons for their decline remain a subject of debate. Some blame foreign invasions, particularly by the Akkadians, mountain tribes from the northeast who overran Akkad cities. Others point to internal rebellions as conquered territories sought to reclaim their independence. But perhaps the most devastating factor was something neither swords nor rulers could control: climate change. Evidence suggests that a massive drought swept across the region, causing widespread famine and economic collapse. Without food, without stability, the empire that once ruled the known world fell apart. Akkad itself, the mighty capital, was abandoned. To this day, no one knows its exact location. How could an empire so powerful disappear so thoroughly? Where was Akkad, the city that ruled the world? And why did history nearly forget its story? These are the questions that continue to haunt archaeologists, historians, and all those who seek to uncover the truth of the past. The Akkadians may be gone, their empire lost to the sands of time, but their influence remains. Every great power that followed, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, borrowed from the Akkadian blueprint. Their language lived on, shaping the tongues of future civilizations. Their administrative systems became the model for countless empires. And so, as we journey back through time, tracing the rise and fall of the world's first empire, we are not just telling the story of a forgotten people. We are uncovering the very foundations of human civilization. The Akkadians were the first to dream of empire, to unify diverse cultures under a single rule, to leave behind a legacy that, even in its ruins, still whispers through the winds of history. Long before the rise of the Akkadian Empire, before Sargon's conquests reshaped the known world, there was Sumer, the first great civilization in human history. It was here, in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that humanity took its first steps toward organized society. Cities emerged where once there had been only scattered villages. Writing was invented to record transactions, laws, and prayers. Towering ziggurats were built, piercing the sky as monuments to the gods. This was the dawn of civilization, a world of innovation and ambition, but also one of endless conflict. The Sumerians were pioneers of human advancement, their culture shaping the very foundation of what we consider civilization today. By the 3rd millennium BCE, they had already developed many of the essential components of urban life. Their cities, Ur, Uruk, Kish, Lagash, and Eridu, stood as independent city-states, each governed by its own ruler, its own priesthood, and its own military. These were not just settlements, but thriving centers of trade, politics, and religion. At the heart of each city was the temple complex, home to the city's patron deity, for in Sumer, the divine and the mortal were inseparable. These temple complexes, known as ziggurats, were among the most striking architectural achievements of their time. Massive, stepped structures, they were built as homes for the gods, hituiter, places where priests could communicate with the divine. The people of Sumer believed their gods had absolute control over their lives, dictating everything from the fertility of their crops to the outcomes of wars. In return, rulers and priests were tasked with keeping these deities appeased, offering sacrifices and ensuring that the temples remained well-maintained. Beyond their religious contributions, the Sumerians gave the world its first writing system, cuneiform. Unlike the pictographs used by the Egyptians, cuneiform was a flexible script capable of representing not just objects but complex ideas. At first, it was used primarily for economic purposes, recording grain transactions, temple donations, and property ownership. But over time, it evolved into a tool for literature, law, and diplomacy. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of literature, was written in cuneiform, preserving the adventures of Uruk's legendary king and his search for immortality. Sumer's political landscape, however, was anything but stable. The city-states were frequently at war with one another, vying for dominance over trade routes, fertile land, and religious prestige. No single ruler controlled all of Sumer for long. Power shifted. As kings rose and fell, alliances were forged and broken, and battles raged between rival cities. Ur and Uruk fought over trade routes. Kish and Lagash waged war for dominance over fertile lands. Every city sought supremacy, yet none could hold it for long. The result was a region in perpetual instability, a land where peace was temporary and war was inevitable. The reasons behind this political fragmentation were deeply rooted in the structure of Sumerian society. Each city-state functioned as an independent political entity, ruled by a lugal, king, or an ensi, governor-priest. These leaders claimed divine legitimacy, often portraying themselves as chosen by the gods to rule over their people. However, their power was limited. Each city had its own traditions, its own patron deity, and its own ambitions. Rulers could gain dominance for a time, but maintaining control over multiple cities was an immense challenge. Sumer was, at its core, a land of competition rather than unity. It was during this time that one man, Lugal-Zagezi, sought to change the course of Sumerian history. A king of Umma, he was one of the first rulers to attempt what no Sumerian before him had truly achieved, unifying all of Sumer under a single rule. Lugal-Zagezi launched an ambitious campaign, conquering city after city, until his influence stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of modern-day Syria. He marched into Uruk, claiming the title of King of the Lands, declaring himself the chosen ruler of the gods. For a moment, it seemed as though Sumer would finally be united under one leader. His success, however, would be short-lived. To the north, in the shadows of Sumer's warring city-states, another force was rising. Akkad, a growing power that had long remained secondary to the might of the Sumerians, was beginning to stir. It was a city on the periphery of Mesopotamian civilization, an emerging state that watched and waited as the Sumerians exhausted themselves in endless conflict. And among its people, one man was preparing to do what no Sumerian king had done before: unite not just Sumer, but an entire empire. This man was Sargon of Akkad, a figure who would soon rise from obscurity to reshape the course of history. Unlike the Sumerian kings before him, Sargon did not seek to rule over a single city or a small coalition. He envisioned something far greater. He saw a world where city-states were no longer divided by rivalries, where a single ruler could command an empire stretching across the known world. His ambition would lead to the birth of the first true empire in human history. But how did Akkad, a relatively unknown city, manage to challenge the power of Sumer? The answer lay in its strategic location and cultural adaptability. Situated further north along the Tigris and Euphrates, Akkad had long been a crossroads of Mesopotamian and Semitic cultures. Unlike the Sumerians, who saw themselves as a distinct people, the Akkadians were more flexible in their approach to governance, integrating different traditions and languages into their rule. This ability to unite diverse populations would prove crucial in the years to come. Lugal-Zagezi may have been the first to dream of a unified Sumer, but it was Sargon who would make that dream a reality. In a dramatic confrontation, Sargon defeated Lugal-Zagezi in battle, capturing him and parading him in chains as a symbol of Akkad's dominance. With this victory, the old Sumerian order began to crumble, and Akkad emerged as the new center of power. The fall of Lugal-Zagezi and the rise of Akkad marked the end of an era. The time of independent city-states was over. The world was about to witness something new: the Age of Empires. The story of Sargon of Akkad is one of legend, ambition, and conquest. Rising from obscurity, he became the first true emperor in human history, establishing a vast dominion that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. His empire, the Akkadian Empire, would become the first centralized state in the ancient world, setting the stage for all future empires. Yet his origins are shrouded in mystery, and his journey from a humble servant to the ruler of the known world remains one of the most extraordinary tales of the ancient past. The legend of Sargon's birth is eerily reminiscent of stories from later civilizations, such as Moses in the Bible and Romulus in Roman mythology. According to Akkadian texts, Sargon was the illegitimate son of a high priestess, a woman sworn to celibacy. Fearing for his life, she placed him in a reed basket and cast him into the Euphrates River, praying that the gods would protect him. The infant drifted downstream until he was found by Aki, a humble gardener, who raised him as his own. Thus, Sargon spent his early years among the laborers and farmers of Mesopotamia, growing up without royal blood or noble lineage, an outsider destined for greatness. Despite his modest upbringing, fate led Sargon into the court of Kish, one of the most powerful city-states in Sumer. There, he entered the service of King Ur-Zababa, eventually rising to the trusted position of cupbearer. In ancient Mesopotamian courts, the cupbearer was not merely a servant, but a figure of importance, holding the king's trust and often acting as a close advisor. This position gave Sargon access to the political and military workings of the kingdom, allowing him to study leadership firsthand. However, King Ur-Zababa grew suspicious of Sargon. According to legend, the king had a prophetic dream that Sargon would one day overthrow him. Filled with paranoia, Ur-Zababa devised a plan to eliminate his cupbearer. He sent Sargon on a mission of death, ordering him to deliver a sealed tablet to Lugal-Zaggisi, the king of Umma. Unbeknownst to Sargon, the message contained orders for his execution. However, rather than meeting his end, Sargon survived and, through a combination of charisma, cunning, and perhaps even divine favor, began to forge his own path to power. Sargon's first major conquest was Kish, the city where he had once served as a mere cupbearer. It is unclear how he seized power. Some accounts suggest a coup, while others claim military conquest. Regardless, by taking control of Kish, Sargon had taken his first step toward empire. However, Kish alone was not enough. To achieve his ambitions, he would have to challenge the greatest power in Sumer, Lugal-Zaggisi of Umma, the man who had recently conquered Uruk, Ur, and other major city-states. Lugal-Zaggisi had spent years consolidating power, successfully uniting much of Sumer under his rule. His army was strong, his reputation formidable, but he underestimated Sargon. The clash between these two rulers would determine the fate of Mesopotamia. The battle for Sumer was brutal. Sargon's forces marched south, engaging Lugal-Zaggisi's armies in a decisive confrontation. Sargon emerged victorious, capturing his rival and ending his reign. Lugal-Zaggisi, once the most powerful man in Sumer, was paraded in chains through the conquered cities, a humiliating display of Akkadian dominance. With his greatest enemy defeated, Sargon seized Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, absorbing them into his growing empire. For the first time, Sumer was under the control of a single ruler, not a Sumerian, but an Akkadian. Having secured Sumer, Sargon took a step no ruler before him had dared. He built an entirely new capital, a city that would serve as the heart of his empire. He called it Akkad, Agade. Though its exact location remains unknown, Akkad became the center of administration, trade, and military might. Unlike the Sumerian city-states, which had long functioned as independent entities, Akkad was a new kind of city, one that represented centralized rule over a vast territory. With Akkad established as his imperial capital, Sargon implemented sweeping changes to ensure his control. He appointed loyal governors, many of whom were Akkadian rather than Sumerian, replacing local rulers who might resist his authority. He also made Akkadian the official language of administration, further integrating the empire under a single system. Sumerian was still spoken, but Akkadian became the language of government and diplomacy, a shift that would shape Mesopotamian civilization for centuries. But Sargon was not satisfied with merely ruling Sumer. He sought to expand his domain beyond the traditional boundaries of Mesopotamia. To achieve this, he created the first professional standing army in history. Unlike previous kings, who relied on temporary militias raised for specific campaigns, Sargon maintained a permanent, well-trained military force. His soldiers were well-equipped, disciplined, and capable of rapid mobilization, allowing Sargon to respond quickly to rebellions and threats. Using his military innovations, Sargon expanded his empire in all directions. To the east, he conquered the Elamites, securing Akkadian control over the Iranian plateau. To the north, he pushed into Assyria, bringing its cities under Akkadian rule. To the west, he marched into the Levant, controlling key trade routes along the Mediterranean coast. And to the south, he secured Akkadian dominance over the Persian Gulf, ensuring access to vital maritime trade networks. At its height, Sargon's empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, a territory larger than anything the world had seen before. His inscriptions boast that he washed his weapons in the sea, a phrase symbolizing his complete control over the lands he had conquered. No longer was Mesopotamia a land of fragmented city-states. It was now an empire, ruled by a single authority. Despite his military success, Sargon faced constant challenges to his rule. Governing such a vast and diverse empire was no easy task. Rebellions erupted throughout his reign as local rulers resisted Akkadian domination. In response, Sargon implemented a system of direct control, stationing Akkadian officials in key regions and maintaining a network of spies and informants to monitor dissent. Sargon's empire was not just built on conquest, it was also an economic powerhouse. Trade flourished under his rule, with goods flowing between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Indus Valley, and even Egypt. Akkadian merchants facilitated long-distance trade, exchanging gold, silver, copper, and textiles across the known world. The empire's irrigation systems ensured stable agriculture, supporting a growing population and fueling the economy. After ruling for over 50 years, Sargon died, leaving behind a legacy unlike any before him. He had created the first true empire, uniting disparate cultures under a single rule. His model of governance, centralized administration, professional military, economic integration, and linguistic unity, would be adopted by future empires, from Babylon to Persia to Rome. However, the Akkadian Empire did not remain stable after his death. His successors faced rebellions, invasions, and internal strife, leading to the empire's eventual decline. But Sargon's legacy endured. His name was remembered for centuries as the model of a great conqueror, the first emperor in recorded history. The world had changed forever. The age of city-states was over. The age of empires had begun. The rise of the Akkadian Empire was not only the result of Sargon's ambition and strategic brilliance, but also the product of a revolutionary military system unlike anything the world had seen before. The Akkadians built the first professional standing army in human history, a force that did not disband after battle, but remained active, trained, and ready to march at any time. This allowed Akkad to maintain control over its vast empire, crush rebellions, and expand further than any Sumerian ruler had ever dreamed. The Akkadian army was a well-organized war machine, relying on standardized weapons, disciplined formations, advanced logistics, and ruthless tactics to dominate Mesopotamia. Through sheer force, the Akkadians subjugated entire cities, deported rebellious populations, and instilled terror in their enemies, ensuring that those who opposed them rarely got a second chance. At the heart of the Akkadian military revolution was standardization. Unlike previous city-state militias that relied on hastily assembled peasant fighters wielding mismatched weapons, Sargon's army was composed of full-time, professional soldiers who were uniformly armed and trained. Their weapons, bronze swords, spears, and battle axes, were mass-produced, ensuring that every soldier was equipped with reliable, high-quality gear. Shields and armor were also crafted to a standard design, allowing soldiers to fight in cohesive formations rather than as disorganized individuals. This level of uniformity gave the Akkadian army greater efficiency and discipline, making them a fearsome force on the battlefield. Sargon also introduced logistical innovations that allowed his armies to campaign for extended periods. While earlier Mesopotamian rulers were limited by the availability of local food supplies, the Akkadians developed a supply system that ensured their troops were well-fed and equipped even in distant territories. This allowed Sargon's forces to march further, fight longer, and recover faster than any army before them. By building a network of storage depots, supply caravans, and way stations, the Akkadian military could sustain prolonged campaigns without relying solely on plundering conquered lands. In battle, the Akkadians employed tightly organized formations, ensuring maximum battlefield efficiency. The backbone of the Akkadian army was the infantry. arranged in disciplined phalanx-style ranks with spearmen in the front and archers in the rear. This formation allowed them to repel enemy charges while launching coordinated counterattacks. But the Akkadians also pioneered new forms of siege warfare, giving them the ability to conquer even the most well-defended cities. Before the rise of Akkad, walled cities were nearly impossible to capture without prolonged blockades or betrayals from within. However, Sargon's engineers developed advanced siege techniques, including the use of battering rams, siege ramps, and sappers to weaken city defenses. Akkadian soldiers would systematically undermine walls, cut off supply routes, and breach fortifications, turning once impenetrable cities into conquered strongholds. These siege tactics allowed Sargon to subjugate even the most fortified city-states, ensuring that Akkadian dominance could not be challenged. Another military innovation that gave the Akkadians an advantage was their use of chariots in warfare. While chariots had existed in Mesopotamia before, they were primarily used in ceremonies or for transportation. The Akkadians transformed them into deadly battlefield weapons, using them for shock charges, skirmishing, and rapid troop deployment. Chariot units could disrupt enemy lines, weaken their formations, and strike fear into opposing forces. This mobility made the Akkadian army far more flexible and unpredictable, allowing Sargon to win battles against numerically superior enemies. However, Akkadian conquest was not just about battlefield victories. It was about control and assimilation. Sargon understood that merely defeating an enemy was not enough. He needed to break their will to resist. The Akkadian army became infamous for its brutality against those who opposed them. Cities that resisted were subjected to mass executions, widespread destruction, and forced deportations. Entire populations were relocated to distant regions, scattering rebellious groups and replacing them with loyal Akkadian settlers. This strategy of mass deportation and forced resettlement ensured that conquered regions lost their local identity and became part of the Akkadian administrative system. Those who refused to submit were simply wiped from existence. One of Sargon's greatest military victories was the conquest of Uruk, the legendary city of Gilgamesh. When Uruk resisted Akkadian rule, Sargon's forces besieged the city, breached its walls, and utterly destroyed its defenses. The city was stripped of its independence, its rulers were executed, and its surviving citizens were forcibly relocated to distant Akkadian territories. By making an example of Uruk, Sargon sent a clear message to other city-states: resist and face complete annihilation. The Akkadian navy was another tool that secured the empire's dominance over Mesopotamia. Though land-based armies had long been the primary force in warfare, the Akkadians understood the strategic value of controlling the rivers. The Euphrates and Tigris were not just waterways. They were highways of trade, supply lines, and military transport. To maintain control over these crucial routes, Sargon established a fleet of warships that patrolled the rivers, ensuring that trade flowed freely while enemy movements were restricted. The Akkadian navy allowed for rapid troop deployment, giving them an advantage over rivals who relied solely on overland travel. By securing river routes from the Persian Gulf to the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, the Akkadians ensured that they controlled both land and water. Beyond the battlefield, Sargon maintained control over his vast empire through garrisons, spies, and forced loyalty. Strategic locations throughout the empire were occupied by Akkadian military outposts, ensuring that any sign of rebellion could be swiftly crushed. Soldiers were permanently stationed in conquered cities, acting as enforcers of Akkadian rule. Spies were embedded within local populations to report any signs of dissent, allowing the central government to act before revolts could gain momentum. This network of intelligence gathering and rapid military response kept the empire under firm control. Sargon also ensured political stability by placing Akkadian governors in charge of key regions, rather than allowing local rulers to maintain power. These governors were personally loyal to Sargon and his successors, ensuring that the empire remained centralized. Any local official suspected of disloyalty was swiftly removed or executed. Under Sargon's rule, the Akkadian military was not just a tool for conquest. It was the backbone of an empire that thrived through force, fear, and control. It was this military power that allowed Sargon to rule for over 5 decades, keeping his empire intact despite internal unrest. His methods, though ruthless, were effective. After Sargon's death, his successors would inherit an empire built on military strength. They would expand upon his legacy, using the Akkadian war machine to push further into new territories. However, while the Akkadian Empire seemed unstoppable at its peak, its reliance on military dominance and harsh rule would eventually become its greatest weakness. The seeds of its downfall had already been sown, waiting to emerge in the years to come. The Akkadian military had transformed the world, setting the standard for every empire that followed. But even the mightiest armies cannot hold back the forces of time, rebellion, and environmental catastrophe. The era of Akkadian conquest would soon give way to the era of Akkadian decline. The rise of the Akkadian Empire was not only a military achievement, but also a political and administrative revolution. Unlike the Sumerian rulers before them who governed independent city-states, the Akkadians created a centralized imperial system, one that could efficiently control a vast and diverse territory. Under Sargon of Akkad and his successors, the empire expanded its governance structures, language policies, trade networks, and agricultural systems, ensuring that it would not only conquer but also rule effectively. These innovations laid the groundwork for future empires, influencing Babylonia, Assyria, Persia, and beyond. At the heart of this transformation was administrative centralization, economic integration, and bureaucratic record-keeping, which allowed the Akkadians to maintain control over their empire for over a century. One of the most significant changes implemented by the Akkadians was the replacement of local Sumerian rulers with Akkadian governors. Before Sargon's rise, Mesopotamia was ruled by independent city-state kings, each of whom had absolute power within their own walls, but rarely commanded territory beyond them. These rulers often fought amongst themselves, competing for land, resources, and religious supremacy. Sargon changed this system completely. Instead of allowing city-states to remain semi-autonomous, he placed loyal Akkadian administrators, called ensi or governors, in key positions throughout the empire. These governors answered directly to the king, ensuring that all regions remained under centralized control. This was a revolutionary departure from the traditional Sumerian model of city-state governance, marking the beginning of a truly imperial system of rule. Additionally, Sargon established a standing army in major cities to maintain order, collect taxes, and suppress any signs of rebellion. The direct governance of conquered territories by Akkadian officials allowed the empire to maintain control over a vast and ethnically diverse population, something no previous Mesopotamian civilization had achieved. In Sumerian society, rulers were seen as representatives of the gods, often ruling in partnership with high priests who wielded significant political power. This meant that religion played a dominant role in governance, with city-states ruled by priest kings, or ensi, who operated within a religious framework. The Akkadians changed this dynamic by shifting power from religious leaders and toward a centralized monarchy. Under the Akkadians, the king became the ultimate authority, not just a servant of the gods, but a supreme ruler who wielded absolute power over both religious and political affairs. This transition is most evident in Naram-Sin, the grandson of Sargon, who even declared himself a living god, an unprecedented claim in Mesopotamian history. This change laid the foundation for future monarchies, where kings would rule by divine right rather than as mere representatives of the gods. By reducing the influence of the priesthood and centralizing power under a single ruler, the Akkadians created a stable and efficient political system, one that allowed them to govern multiple regions and ethnic groups under a single authority. Akkadian as the official language, replacing Sumerian in government and trade. One of the most enduring innovations of the Akkadian administration was the adoption of Akkadian as the official language of government and trade. Before the rise of Akkad, Sumerian was the dominant language in Mesopotamia, used for government documents, religious texts, and commerce. However, Sumerian was a language isolate, meaning it had no known relatives, making it difficult for non-Sumerians to learn. Akkadian, on the other hand, was a Semitic language, related to languages spoken by peoples throughout the Near East. By making Akkadian the official language, the empire facilitated easier communication between different ethnic groups and created a common linguistic framework for administration and trade. This decision had long-lasting effects. Even after the Akkadian Empire collapsed, Akkadian remained the dominant written and spoken language of Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years. It became the language of diplomacy, used in treaties between empires as distant as Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. Future civilizations, including the Babylonians and Assyrians, continued using Akkadian in their government, reinforcing its role as the first imperial language in history. The Akkadian Empire was not just a military powerhouse, it was also a commercial giant, establishing vast trade networks that connected Mesopotamia with distant civilizations. Sargon and his successors expanded trade routes that reached the Indus Valley, modern-day Pakistan and India. Akkadian merchants imported copper, ivory, and semi-precious stones from the Indus cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The Akkadians traded with the Hittites and other Anatolian cultures for silver, timber, and horses. Elam and Iran, trade routes brought gold, precious stones, and textiles from the Iranian plateau. The Levant, modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. The Akkadians established control over key coastal cities, allowing them to trade with merchants from the Mediterranean. This extensive trade network ensured that wealth flowed into Akkadian cities, enriching the empire and allowing for cultural exchanges that influenced everything from art to religious practices. Controlling a vast empire meant ensuring that there was enough food to sustain its population. To accomplish this, the Akkadians expanded and improved Mesopotamian irrigation systems, ensuring that farmlands remained productive even in arid conditions. Canals and reservoirs to store and distribute water. Large-scale irrigation projects that allowed crops to grow in previously dry areas. A centralized grain storage system, ensuring that food surpluses could be redistributed. These agricultural innovations allowed the Akkadian population to grow rapidly, creating larger urban centers and fueling the expansion of the empire. Even after the Akkadian Empire collapsed, later Mesopotamian civilizations continued to use these irrigation techniques, ensuring long-term agricultural stability in the region. The Akkadians inherited the Sumerian cuneiform writing system, but they took it to new heights, expanding its use to administration, taxation, military records, and trade documentation. This was the world's first bureaucratic system, allowing officials to track everything from grain production to the movement of soldiers. Tax records, keeping track of what each region owed to the empire. Legal codes, standardizing laws across the empire. Diplomatic treaties, writing agreements between Akkad and foreign powers. Military logistics, recording troop numbers, supplies, and battle outcomes. The expansion of cuneiform allowed the Akkadians to efficiently govern a massive empire, setting the stage for later civilizations like the Babylonians and Assyrians to develop even more advanced bureaucratic systems. The Akkadian system of administration became the model for all future Mesopotamian empires. Their methods of governance, centralized rule, economic policies, and bureaucratic innovations were adopted and refined by later civilizations, ensuring that their influence lasted long after the empire itself had fallen. Though Akkad as a city may be lost to time, its innovations laid the groundwork for the very concept of empire, proving that a single ruler could control vast and diverse lands through efficient administration, economic integration, and military discipline. The Akkadians may have been the first empire builders, but their model would shape history for millennia. The death of Sargon of Akkad left the world's first empire in the hands of his successors, rulers who faced an empire sprawling, diverse, and teetering on the edge of rebellion. Though Sargon had laid the foundation for imperial rule, maintaining control over such a vast domain was an unprecedented challenge. Immediately after his death, revolts erupted across Mesopotamia as subject cities and regions sought to reclaim their independence. The conquered people of Elam, Sumer, and the Levant, who had lived under Akkadian rule for decades, began testing the limits of the empire, challenging the authority of Sargon's sons and successors. Ramush and Manishtushu, the sons of Sargon, struggled to hold the empire together, spending much of their reigns quelling uprisings and reasserting Akkadian dominance. But the Akkadian Empire would not reach its true peak until the reign of Naram-Sin, the grandson of Sargon, who would not only restore Akkadian supremacy, but take the empire to heights never before seen. Where Sargon had laid the foundations of empire, Naram-Sin would refine, expand, and elevate it into a golden age. His reign was one of unparalleled military conquest, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing, but also of controversy. He would become the first Mesopotamian king to declare himself a god, fundamentally changing the nature of kingship in the ancient world. Before Naram-Sin could usher in the golden age of Akkad, he had to first restore order to an empire in crisis. After the deaths of Sargon's sons, the empire was once again plagued by rebellions on all fronts. City-states in Sumer, long resentful of Akkadian domination, rose up in defiance. The Elamites, who had been brought under Akkadian rule, attempted to break free. The empire seemed on the verge of collapse, with enemies both internal and external threatening its stability. Naram-Sin's first priority was to crush these revolts with overwhelming force. His campaigns against rebellious Sumerian cities were swift and brutal. Towns that resisted were razed to the ground, their leaders executed, and their people deported to distant regions. He marched into Elam, ensuring that the rebellious kingdom was once again brought to heel. In the north, he dealt with the Hurrians and the Gutians, who had begun raiding Akkadian-controlled cities. By the time he had completed these campaigns, the Akkadian Empire was more unified than ever before. However, Naram-Sin was not satisfied with merely restoring order. He wanted to surpass his grandfather's achievements and take Akkad to even greater heights. With the empire stabilized, Naram-Sin turned his attention outward, embarking on some of the most ambitious military campaigns in Mesopotamian history. While Sargon had established the Akkadian Empire's dominance over Mesopotamia, Naram-Sin pushed beyond those borders, expanding Akkadian influence further than ever before. To the east, he marched into the Zagros Mountains, subduing fierce tribes that had long resisted Mesopotamian rule. These mountain peoples, including the Lulubi and the Gutians, had plagued trade routes and launched raids on Akkadian cities. Naram-Sin's campaigns brought them under direct Akkadian control, ensuring the empire's borders were secure. To the north, he pushed deep into Anatolia, establishing Akkadian dominance over cities that had never before been ruled by Mesopotamians. His armies marched across the Taurus Mountains, defeating kings and incorporating their lands into the Akkadian sphere of influence. To the west, Naram-Sin expanded into the Levant, securing control over trade routes that connected Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean. These campaigns ensured that Akkadian merchants had direct access to key trade hubs, further enriching the empire. Naram-Sin's conquests made him the most powerful ruler of his time. His empire was now the largest the world had ever seen, surpassing even Sargon's achievements. But it was not just military expansion that defined his reign. He sought to reshape the very institution of kingship itself. One of the most controversial and groundbreaking aspects of Naram-Sin's reign was his declaration of divinity. For centuries, Mesopotamian kings had ruled as servants of the gods, acting as their earthly representatives. They built temples, performed rituals, and sought divine favor, but they never claimed to be gods themselves. Naram-Sin broke this tradition. He declared himself a god king, the king of the four quarters of the world, demanding that he be worshipped as a living deity. This was unprecedented in Mesopotamian history and marked a fundamental shift in how kingship was perceived. The reasons behind Naram-Sin's divine claim are debated. Some historians believe he genuinely believed himself to be divine, a ruler who had transcended mortal status due to his unmatched success. Others suggest that this was a political move designed to solidify his authority and prevent further rebellions. If he was a god, then to oppose him was to oppose the divine order itself. Regardless of the reasoning, this act set a precedent for future rulers, influencing later Mesopotamian and even Egyptian pharaohs who would also claim divine status. It also reinforced the idea that the Akkadian Empire was more than just a political entity. It was a divine kingdom, ruled by the will of the gods. One of the most famous artifacts from Naram-Sin's reign is the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, a massive stone monument that depicts the Akkadian king in his divine form. Carved to commemorate his victory over the Lulubi people, the stele portrays Naram-Sin wearing a horned crown, a symbol traditionally reserved for the gods. He is shown towering over his enemies, stepping on their bodies as they lie defeated beneath him. His soldiers follow him in perfect formation, illustrating the power and discipline of the Akkadian military. This stele is one of the first known works of art to depict a historical event rather than a purely religious scene, marking a shift in how rulers chose to represent themselves. It is also one of the earliest examples of royal propaganda, using imagery to reinforce the idea that Naram-Sin was more than just a king. He was a god of war, an unconquerable force. Naram-Sin's reign was not just defined by conquest, it was also a time of cultural flourishing and artistic achievement. The Akkadian Empire under his rule saw the construction of monumental temples, palaces, and administrative centers, showcasing the empire's wealth and sophistication. Akkadian art evolved, incorporating more realistic depictions of the human form and detailed battle scenes that glorified the might of the empire. One of the greatest achievements of this period was the standardization of cuneiform writing, which became the official script of the empire. Akkadian replaced Sumerian as the dominant written language, ensuring a unified bureaucratic system that could effectively govern a vast territory. Akkadian influence spread across Mesopotamia, shaping the culture of future civilizations. Even after the Akkadian Empire eventually fell, its artistic and architectural innovations continued to influence Babylonian and Assyrian culture for centuries. The height of Akkadian power, but for how long? Naram-Sin's reign marked the peak of the Akkadian Empire, a time when military supremacy, economic strength, and cultural advancements were at their highest. He had expanded the empire further than any ruler before him, established a new model of kingship, and ensured Akkadian culture dominated the ancient Near East. But no empire lasts forever. While Naram-Sin's rule was one of glory and prosperity, cracks had already begun to form. New threats, both internal and external, loomed on the horizon. The same forces of rebellion and environmental catastrophe that had threatened Akkad in the past were beginning to stir once more. The golden age of Akkad was at its height, but its decline was coming. The Akkadian Empire, the first great empire in human history, once stood as the undisputed master of Mesopotamia. Under Sargon the Great and his grandson Naram-Sin, Akkad had grown into a vast and powerful state, ruling over lands that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Elam. For over a century, the Akkadian kings had reshaped the political, military, and cultural landscape of the ancient world, leaving a legacy that would influence future civilizations for millennia. However, no empire is eternal. By the end of the 22nd century BCE, the once mighty Akkadian state was crumbling. Its fall was not the result of a single event, but rather a series of interconnected disasters: barbarian invasions, internal revolts, economic collapse, and a devastating climate catastrophe that turned the land into a barren wasteland. As Akkad's rulers struggled to maintain control, the empire fractured, its cities burned, and the world's first imperial capital was mysteriously abandoned, never to rise again. One of the greatest external threats to Akkad came from the Gutians, a fierce and warlike people from the Zagros Mountains to the east of Mesopotamia. Little is known about these mountain tribes, as they left no written records of their own, but Akkadian and later Sumerian sources depict them as barbaric raiders, wild, uncivilized, and ruthless. The Gutians had long lived on the fringes of Akkadian rule, watching as Sargon and his successors built a vast empire, but they remained outside the structured world of Mesopotamian city-states, existing as nomadic herders and warriors. At first, they were little more than raiders, launching small-scale attacks on outlying Akkadian settlements, plundering villages and stealing livestock. However, as Akkad weakened due to internal strife and environmental hardships, the Gutians saw their opportunity. Their raids grew bolder and more frequent, striking deeper into Akkadian territory. Eventually, they invaded in full force, overwhelming Akkadian defenses and marching toward the heart of the empire. Unlike previous enemies, the Gutians were not city builders or organized rulers. They did not seek to govern like the Akkadians or the Sumerians before them. They came only to destroy. The Akkadian military, which had once been the most advanced and disciplined force in the world, was now stretched thin. After decades of constant warfare and rebellions, the once powerful army was fractured, exhausted, and unable to mount a unified defense. City after city fell to the Gutian assault, and soon, even the capital of Akkad itself was under threat. While the Gutians pressed their attack from the east, Akkad was also collapsing from within. Many of the city-states that had been conquered by Sargon and Naram-Sin had never truly accepted Akkadian rule, and now, sensing weakness, they rose in rebellion. Cities like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash declared their independence, rejecting Akkadian authority. The empire that had once ruled all of Mesopotamia was now fracturing into smaller, competing kingdoms, a reversal of the unification that Sargon had achieved over a century earlier. In the south, the Sumerian cities that had once been the foundation of Akkadian power began fighting against Akkadian control, expelling Akkadian governors and reclaiming their autonomy. Akkadian administrators were executed, temples were rededicated to local gods, and statues of Akkadian kings were torn down or defaced in acts of defiance. The Akkadians, once seen as the undisputed masters of Mesopotamia, were now hated overlords whose rule had collapsed into chaos. Akkad's economic foundation was also disintegrating. Trade routes once protected by Akkadian armies were now unsafe, as Gutian and local rebel forces disrupted commerce. The long-distance trade that had enriched Akkad for generations ground to a halt, cutting off the flow of precious metals, timber, and food supplies that had sustained the empire. With its economy crumbling and its cities in revolt, Akkad was losing its grip on power. While invasions and revolts were major causes of Akkad's downfall, perhaps the most devastating blow came not from an enemy army, but from nature itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that around the time of Akkad's collapse, a catastrophic climate shift occurred, leading to a prolonged period of drought and agricultural failure. For centuries, Mesopotamian civilization had depended on the flooding cycles of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which provided fertile soil for farming. However, in the decades leading up to Akkad's fall, the climate began to change dramatically. Rainfall patterns shifted, the once lush farmlands turned into arid deserts, and crop yields plummeted. This prolonged drought devastated the agricultural economy of Mesopotamia. Without enough food, starvation spread, cities could no longer sustain their populations, and famine weakened both the Akkadian military and the general population. The empire, already struggling with rebellion and invasion, was now crippled by hunger and disease. Desperate for resources, Akkadian rulers may have overtaxed the population, further alienating the very people they depended on for survival. This worsened the revolts as starving citizens turned against their rulers. The once mighty Akkadian Empire was now losing its ability to support itself, and its collapse was inevitable. The last great Akkadian ruler was Shar-Kali-Shari, the son of Naram-Sin. He inherited an empire in crisis, facing constant invasions, internal revolts, and environmental disaster. Despite his efforts to hold the empire together, his reign was one of perpetual warfare and instability. Unlike Sargon and Naram-Sin, who had expanded the empire, Shar-Kali-Shari spent his rule fighting merely to keep it from falling apart. Though he won several battles against the Gutians and rebellious cities, his victories were short-lived. The Akkadian army, once the most feared force in the ancient world, could no longer sustain itself. Each battle weakened his forces further, and Akkad's enemies grew stronger. Eventually, Shar-Kali-Shari was either killed in battle or overthrown, and with his death, Akkad descended into complete anarchy. The final fate of the city of Akkad remains one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Despite being the center of the greatest empire of its time, the city was completely abandoned and never rebuilt. Later Sumerian texts describe the destruction of God as a divine punishment, blaming Naram-Sin's claim to godhood for angering the gods. Some historians believe that the city was sacked by the Gutians, its population slaughtered or scattered. Others suggest that climate disaster forced its abandonment, as famine and drought made it uninhabitable. Whatever the cause, Akkad disappeared from history, leaving no ruins to mark its once glorious existence. For centuries, archaeologists and historians have searched for the lost city of Akkad, yet its exact location remains unknown. Some theories suggest it lies beneath the Tigris River, varied by centuries of shifting landscapes. Others propose that the city was systematically destroyed and its materials repurposed by later civilizations. Regardless of its physical fate, Akkad lives on in history as the first empire, a civilization that rose from nothing, conquered the known world, and then vanished into legend. Its rulers, from Sargon to Naram-Sin, reshaped Mesopotamia, leaving a blueprint for future empires to follow. But its fall remains a warning from history. No matter how powerful an empire may seem, it is never invincible. The Akkadian Empire was the first, but it would not be the last. Others would rise in its place. But for all its greatness, Akkad was gone, swallowed by time. Its empire turned to dust. Though the Akkadian Empire collapsed in a storm of invasions, internal strife, and environmental catastrophe, its impact on history was far from over. The Akkadians may have vanished as a political force, but their ideas, innovations, and cultural achievements endured for centuries, shaping the civilizations that followed. From Babylon to Assyria, from Persia to the Hittites, nearly every major empire of the ancient Near East owed something to the Akkadians. Their system of imperial governance, military strategy, language, art, and mythology laid the foundation for the future of Mesopotamian civilization. Even though their once great capital of Akkad disappeared from history, their legacy continued to live on through the cultures they influenced. One of the most lasting contributions of the Akkadian Empire was its governance model, which became a blueprint for nearly every empire that followed. Before Sargon, Mesopotamia was a fragmented land of warring city-states, each ruled independently by its own king. Sargon revolutionized the system by centralizing power, placing loyal governors in key regions instead of allowing local rulers to maintain autonomy. This system ensured that the empire remained unified under a single administration, reducing the likelihood of rebellion. Later empires, including Babylonia and Assyria, adopted and refined this model, creating vast bureaucracies that allowed them to govern diverse and sprawling territories. Even the Persians, centuries later, would implement a similar system of satraps, regional governors, following the Akkadian example of imperial administration. Another enduring legacy of the Akkadians was their language, which dominated Mesopotamian diplomacy and government for over 1,000 years. Before Akkad, Sumerian was the dominant language of the region, used in administration, law, and literature. However, Sargon and his successors replaced Sumerian with Akkadian as the official language of the empire, making it the first widespread imperial language. Even after the Akkadian Empire fell, its language continued to be used as the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, becoming the diplomatic language of kings, merchants, and scribes from Anatolia to Egypt. The Babylonians and Assyrians continued writing in Akkadian long after Akkad itself had disappeared, and the language persisted in official documents, treaties, and royal inscriptions for centuries. Beyond governance and language, the Akkadians also left an indelible mark on art, literature, and mythology. Akkadian sculptors and artisans produced some of the most iconic works of Mesopotamian art, including royal steles, statues, and intricate cylinder seals that depicted kings, gods, and battle scenes in stunning detail. The victory stele of Naram-Sin, with its bold depiction of the Akkadian king as a god towering over his enemies, set a precedent for future rulers who wished to portray themselves as divine conquerors. This artistic style influenced later civilizations, including the Babylonians and Assyrians, who modeled their royal propaganda on Akkadian imagery. Akkadian mythology also merged with Sumerian traditions, creating a hybrid religious and literary culture that would shape later civilizations. Many Sumerian myths were preserved and adapted by Akkadian scribes, ensuring their survival long after the fall of Sumer. The Akkadians also produced original literary works, many of which laid the groundwork for later Mesopotamian texts. Even the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known pieces of literature, was preserved and expanded upon by Akkadian writers, ensuring its survival for future generations. Militarily, the Akkadian war machine set the standard for all future Mesopotamian armies. Sargon's professional standing army, his use of logistical supply chains, and his reliance on trained, full-time soldiers became the model that later empires would follow. The Babylonians and Assyrians studied Akkadian military tactics, learning from their use of chariots, siege warfare, and psychological intimidation. Even their methods of deporting rebellious populations were later refined by the Neo-Assyrians, who took Akkadian policies of mass relocation to an even greater extreme. Perhaps the greatest testament to the Akkadian legacy is how their story was preserved. Though their empire fell, later Mesopotamian civilizations remembered the Akkadians as the founders of empire. The Babylonians and Assyrians wrote about Sargon's exploits, portraying him as the ideal conqueror, a model for future kings to follow. Even centuries after Akkad had fallen, rulers across Mesopotamia claimed to be the heirs of Sargon, invoking his name to justify their own expansions. The Sumerians, too, recorded Akkadian history, though often from a critical perspective, blaming Naram-Sin's claim to godhood for the empire's downfall. These accounts, preserved in clay tablets and temple inscriptions, ensured that the Akkadian story was never forgotten. In the end, the Akkadian Empire was the first great experiment in empire building, proving that a single ruler could govern a vast, multicultural territory. Though the empire itself did not survive, its impact on politics, language, military strategy, art, and literature shaped the civilizations that followed. Every empire that arose in Mesopotamia, from Babylon to Persia, from Alexander the Great to the Romans, owed something to Akkad. Even in its downfall, Akkad achieved immortality, its legacy woven into the fabric of history itself. The empire may have vanished, but its influence endures, a testament to the power and ambition of the world's first true empire. The Akkadians were the world's first empire builders, pioneers in a form of governance that would shape history for millennia. Before Akkad, Mesopotamia was a fractured land of city-states, each governed by its own king, constantly at war with one another. Sargon of Akkad changed everything, proving that a single ruler could unite vast, diverse regions under a centralized authority. His successors built upon this foundation, refining the systems of governance, military conquest, and cultural integration that later empires Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, and Rome would adopt and expand. The concept of empire, so deeply ingrained in human history, began with the Akkadians. Even today, the way modern states manage administration, diplomacy, and military control owes something to the model first established by the Akkadians. Yet, despite their innovations and dominance, the Akkadians eventually disappeared into the pages of history, their empire crumbling under the weight of invasions, rebellion, and environmental catastrophe. Their capital, Akkad, once the heart of the ancient world, was completely abandoned and lost, its exact location still undiscovered by archaeologists. This great imperial city, which once stood as the symbol of Akkadian power, has never been found. Was it buried under the shifting sands of Mesopotamia? Swallowed by the changing course of the Tigris or Euphrates? Systematically destroyed by their enemies? The mystery of Akkad's fate continues to captivate historians and archaeologists alike, as new excavations and research seek to uncover its final resting place. But even without its ruins, Akkad's legacy remains immortal. Every empire that came after borrowed from its model of governance, its methods of administration, and its approach to conquest. The Babylonians and Assyrians carried on Akkadian traditions, refining them and expanding upon them. The idea of a centralized ruler, supported by governors, ruling over vast territories with a standing army and a common bureaucratic system, is a model that persisted throughout history. Even the concept of using a single, standardized language for administration and diplomacy, first established under the Akkadians, continued for centuries. The Akkadian story matters today because it represents the origins of empire, the first attempt at large-scale governance, and the first real fusion of multiple cultures under a single rule. Their rise and fall serve as a blueprint for the cycles of history, showing how great powers can emerge, dominate, and then collapse due to internal and external pressures. The Akkadian Empire was the first of its kind, but it would not be the last. From Rome to the British Empire, from the Mongols to modern superpowers, the same challenges: military expansion, internal governance, cultural assimilation, economic stability, and environmental threats have remained constants throughout history. The greatest lesson from Akkad's rise and fall is that no empire, no matter how powerful, is invincible. For all their military strength, political ingenuity, and cultural influence, the Akkadians could not escape the forces of time, rebellion, and environmental change. And yet, their influence remains. Their innovations in language, governance, and warfare continue to shape our understanding of civilization itself. The Akkadian Empire may have vanished, but its echoes still reverberate through history, reminding us that even the greatest civilizations can fall, but their legacies endure. Akkad may be lost, but the empire it created changed the world forever.